Stephen has a PhD in operations research. He describes himself as an energy geek and recovering economist. He's held a variety of senior positions in the electricity industry, has participated in a range of industry working groups over the last 20 years and been at the forefront of the major regulatory changes in that time. He was recently chair of FlexForum, is a director at Sapir Research Group and co-owner of Whiteboard Energy, and now provides advice to energy industry participants primarily in scenario development, technology, decarbonisation, investment, strategy and market design. So thanks, Stephen.
So good to be here today. Otago's got quite a special place for me because 2000, I'm going to look at Janet, 2007, 8, 9, I helped Janet and Jerry Carrington and others set up the National Energy Research Institute, NERI, here at Otago, which was awesome. It was a cracking couple of years, so always glad to come back here. I've got a couple of things I want to say just before I get into the topic. Firstly, Phoebe and Kim, your presentations were riveting. Where's Phoebe gone? Yeah, really interested, and I'm like putting the two together is a thought process that's going through me because the secret sauce of the Jen Taylor model is that they've got generation, right? So that's something to be fascinating to talk to you guys about solar helping you with your hedging requirements, you know. So yeah, that was just as I was watching it, and you both presented beautifully on the topics, and I think there's something there, so thank you for that. The other thing is, just a sidestep, I'm going to be here talking sort of on flexibility, FlexForum stuff today. Before I do that, I'm going to talk about Whiteboard, which is a company, it sounds really important, it's a passion project, let's call it that a buddy of mine and I set up in 2011. It's still running today. We run sort of industry training around the electricity industry and the energy industry more broadly, and we do sort of everything from new graduates coming in and getting jobs in the industry through to new directors or executives coming into the various power companies. And we've done about, I think we've put 1,300, I think, participants through those courses over the year. Over the last 15 years. And at the start of these sessions, we always ask them a set of burning questions. And I really wish we'd started writing them down when we started doing this, but about 5 years ago, we decided we'd start recording them. And I would say 2 out of every 3 sessions we had with these people that were relatively new to the industry, they would ask the question, what's going to be the impact of climate change on weather-driven renewables, particularly hydro? And we always said, Jen Purdy, there's your answer. So I'm having a bit of a fan moment here because for years I've been saying this woman has contributed to a really important gap in the understanding of the industry. So it's great to actually meet you in person. I've been quoting you. I don't think I've plagiarized. I think I've quoted you numerous times. So absolutely fantastic to meet you finally, and yeah, kudos for the work you've done. It's fantastic. So that's the second thing I want to say. Third thing I wanted to say is Marcos and I didn't compare notes. So I may repeat some stuff he said. He'll say it better. I'll sort of bodge my way through it. But maybe repeating the same thing a couple of times won't be a bad outcome. But it was a shame I missed Marcos's presentation. Always love hearing him talk about the stuff and the work that EECA's doing, which I'll probably chat to a fair bit today. So I'm just going to introduce what FlexForum is first, of which Otago University, we're very proud to have you as a member. And then I'll come back to the mahi of FlexForum later, because I want to explain the nature of the beast as it is at the moment, and then that might make the work we're doing a little bit more obvious. But it's an independent incorporated society. It has its own purpose statement, which we have to be faithful to, so we can't be bought. And really the purpose statement is about making flexibility, which we'll talk about exactly what we mean by that, and Marcos probably gave you a cracking definition as well, making flexibility easy for households, businesses and communities. And that's something we take quite seriously because there's plenty of resources on the supply side to think about flexibility on the supply side. What we're focused on is what does it look like to the human, the person who has the power bill or the household or the business. So that's very much what we're focused on. As I say, I'll talk later on about the kind of work that FlexForum does. Our members, 34 members, 35 I think we're up to now. About half of them, if you could do a quick scan across those logos, which I don't expect you to, you'd find that about half of our members are from the traditional supply chain, and about half of them, I mean, you'll see Blackyard, Ivory Egg, and Telehub are kind of outside that traditional part of the electricity ecosystem, if you wanted to call it that. And that's a reflection of flexibility being one of those things that kind of breaks the old molds of, you know, generation, transmission, distribution, consumption. It's sort of trying to invade in different ways. So you've got appliance people, you know, appliance retailers, standards, technology providers, all in the tent. And so we have some fascinating discussions, which I'll give you a flavour of later on. Most of these organisations here pay to be part of FlexForum, which means they give their time, but they also give their money, which is really important to us because you sort of wake up every morning wanting to honour the fact that they have written a cheque to keep us going. We do get grant funding. Araaki gave us a cornerstone grant funding for our first year of operation, but now the organisation survives on member subscriptions, which is fantastic to have that support from the industry. Do I have a pointy thing by any chance? That's all right, I can arm wave. I do it, oh yeah, there we go. Right, flexibility, just to be clear what we're talking about here today, it's the degree to which someone's usage, consumption, if you want, of power or generation of power could respond to a signal from the system. Obviously our usage varies naturally through the things we're trying to do. Flexibility is about if I got an instruction from someone to say it's really valuable if you increase consumption or decrease consumption or increase generation, decrease generation right now for this long and then stop doing it and go back to what you were doing before, that's what flexibility is. It's the idea of a signal coming from the system in whatever shape or form that is. So that's just framing, just make sure we're on the same page of flexibility. Sidestep, the other thing we do in Whiteboard is David and I got completely distracted from running courses about 6 or 7 years ago and decided to go on the road with a cameraman, the guy who did the Narnia films, who gave us a dirt cheap rate, a script writer and an editor, and we filmed a documentary on the history of the people that built the New Zealand power system. So instead of focusing on the tech, we wanted to tell it through the eyes of the people who actually did it. So full disclaimer, if you go to YouTube, type in Powering NZ or Powering New Zealand, 4 episodes. Each episode's about 2 glasses of wine long. Just be aware of that. I'm just trying to think. I was going to say best on a Friday night, but probably you've got much better things to do on a Friday night than watch 30 minutes episode of Powering New Zealand. Maybe, yeah, not Saturday morning, you won't want wine. So we spent really good money on the recording, the editing and the script writing, and we spent nothing on the on-screen talent. So don't use the feedback form to give us feedback on how we did on screen. We already got it all within about the first 6 weeks of it being launched, so no need for any more. Social media is cruel. On the screen is what we believe is the Southern Hemisphere's first electricity system. So on the left is the Southern Hemisphere's first hydro generator, which is in a little backcountry place behind Queenstown, where I live. So if any of you have driven the Skippers Road, where you can't get insurance for your rental car, that hairy piece of road, you get to Skippers Cemetery, hop out of your car and go for the 3-hour hike up Skippers Creek. The creek branches at one point and you get a left branch and a right branch, and that's what they're actually called, very imaginative names. The left branch of Skippers Creek ends up where that power station house there is, and that's a 27 kilowatt Pelton wheel hydro generator that was built in 1886, first one in the Southern Hemisphere, right? And actually Doc has just recently re-established that shed over the ruins of the power station, so you can actually go in there and have a look if you can be bothered. Then what the people in 1886 did is they took 3 kilometres of copper wire and they went over one of the most insanely steep ridge lines called Southberg Spur, and they dropped into the right branch of Skippers Creek where there was the thing on the right, which again, we believe based on the research we've done, and when I say we, I mean David, he did all the hard work on this, is the world's largest electric motor at the time. Okay, and that was driving a thing called a stamping battery. And if you're not familiar with a stamping battery, you grab your big sort of rough rocks of quartz, the white rock, you throw it in a thing and it gets pounded down by some big stampers, and then you find the gold in it and you extract it. So it's all about gold. So that motor on the right-hand side was powering the stamping battery. They were connected by a line. We believe it's the first transmission line in the Southern Hemisphere. Transpower seems to have missed it off its asset register. And we actually flew in there. I don't know whether you guys listened to the Energy Transitions podcast, Chris Nelder's global podcast on energy. He was in town a few weeks ago. We hopped in a helicopter and we actually went hunting for the transmission line, and we found some old poles sticking out the side of the hill. So you're just looking at this going, how on earth did these guys do it? Anyway, that's besides the point. The point is, what happened here is it was a DC system, so there's no frequency involved for the technical people in the room. It was mainly around voltage. And you could vary the hydro up and down a bit based on what water was coming out of the water race they had dug. Over at the Bullendale end, school was the town, you've got the school lit, you've got the hotel lit, you've got the stamping battery. That's got varying demands, but you could never perfectly match all of that all the time. So what you ended up with was a situation with there being some times where demand had to kind of go, all right, I just accept the fact, I can't consume at the moment. And there were some times where the generator, they had a state-of-the-art communication system going back to the generator saying, we actually need 3 more kilowatts from you right now. So there was this kind of symbiotic relationship between generation and demand where each of them were doing what they could within their limitations, and sometimes demand had to be deprived. So you kind of had this locked-in system that was operating really well. And that actually underpinned much of the next, that was 1886, that underpinned much of the next 20 odd years of development in New Zealand. They were these point schemes, O'Kerry Falls, Reefton, and others like that, where they were just connecting generation to demand, and they each kind of had to go, oh, we'll do what we can within the confines. In 1898, the New Zealand government said, from now on, we're going to be the ones that build scale generation, and we're only going to build hydro. So New Zealand made a commitment, a 60-year commitment from 1898 to 1959 to only build hydro. And that's where things got kind of real, because you were building bigger power stations, you were connecting them to each other, so you got this kind of network effect of shared reliability. But still, we would go through periods of rationing as a country through the 20s, 30s, and 40s. Sometimes we'd build too much. Arapuni on the Waikato River, when it was built, was 3 times New Zealand's national demand. Imagine if a gentailer came out today and says, I'm going to build a power station that's 3 times New Zealand's national demand. It just wouldn't happen, right? But the government did that in 1927. By the same token, around 1940, I think it was, 4 turbines destined for the Waipapa hydropower station, I think, were sunk by a German U-boat coming off. So you had these both ups and downs. So we did go through periods of rationing, and New Zealand just kind of got used to that. They were just happy to have power, right? Other thing that was going on in the 30s and 40s was, I don't know whether even you've heard of the 2-way switch, which used to sit in the kitchen. And if you flick the switch up, you got to heat your water in your water cylinder, which was another invention by a Kiwi called Lloyd Mandanode, by the way. And if the switch went down, you could get the oven going. You couldn't have both. And that was a way, hey? There you go. I'm not making this up. You're the first person ever to go, we had one. That's great. I don't know whether that's a good thing or not, but yeah. But yeah, no, that was the switch that limited peak demand. So you had rationing because of hydro droughts, and you had this 2-way switch to say, I'm actually going to limit what you can consume at peak times by making you choose between hot water and range. So that was quite an innovative thing. Yeah, so we carried on with the ration until 1960. Then the New Zealand government, in its wisdom, kind of said, the people, the peasants are revolting. They're not that happy with having rationing all the time. So we need to start to find some other fuels that can back up hydro. And so began the era of oil and diesel and geothermal. I mean, Wairakei, the world's first practical scalable geothermal power station, is still operating today. Wairakei was commissioned in the 1960s. We stumbled across the world's 6th largest gas reservoir in the form of Maui. So it sort of seemed silly not to make use of that. We thought all our Christmases had come at once. So thermal became the sort of on-tap fuel that could be there when hydro wasn't. So it was sort of like having a container full of oil, a container full of diesel, and eventually coal at Huntly, gas with Maui was the complement to hydro. So that's when we began that journey through that time. Hot water control, ripple control, I'm going to look for Rafferty. He's the expert here. Was it 1960s? The hot water ripple control kind of came in the 1960s, I think, wasn't it? Yep. One at Otago's own, I'd just say, done a brilliant piece of work on hot water control here. So any questions about hot water control, go to Rafferty. Parker, don't come to me. Now, so through 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, that was kind of the way we built the power system. And literally when I joined the energy industry in 2002, this is not an unfair characterization that we would go, consumers are going to do what they're going to do, and it's our job as the supply side of the industry to do God's work and run around and build all the stuff that they need to meet whatever they are going to need at any point in time. Subject to hot water control still being there, it's still there today. We'll talk about that in a second. And that two-way switch possibly still being around in Janet's kitchen. So the tailwind we had going into the market design commenced 1996 or into the start of the 21st century was very much this is a supply side game. Consumers are going to do what they're going to do. Despite the fact there were conversations about energy efficiency and demand side management, that was the framing. And that has sort of continued through to recent times where the conversation has started to change, and flexibility has been one of the things that triggered it, not just in New Zealand, but globally, this idea that, hang on a minute, we've got some opportunities here and we're going to start talking about the opportunities. Skip over that. So hot water control, I've talked about that now. ECA, one of Marcos's reports from 2020, I think it was, on hot water control, just to underscore the significance of hot water control. I think they were based on about 2018, 2019 numbers. At peak demand in the morning or the evening and winter on a weekday, 660 megawatts of hot water control was available. Now that's 2/3 of the entire Huntly Power Station site, right? So this is not small stuff. Just to underscore that point, hot water control was really important. The other bit of demand side management we did, which was slightly less pleasant and got politically very tenuous after doing it 3 times in the first decade of the 21st century, was what happened when the lakes went dry. And our tool, to some extent as an industry then, was to go, the lakes had gone dry. 2001 was the first one where we all kind of went, I was at Mighty River at the time. We hadn't had a dry year since the market commenced. So this was sort of the first time we were staring at the worm on the screen with prices going high, going, what on earth do we do here? Janet did warn me she was going to leave, but just thought I'd draw attention to that. So this was all new to all of us, and the tool of, I wouldn't say last resort, but the tool of resort was to go up the steps of the Beehive to the then Minister, your own Pete Hodgson, and say, Pete, would you mind going on camera telling the people of New Zealand that the lakes are low and they need to turn off their spa pools and electric blankets? And the reality was it wasn't spa pools and electric blankets, it was often low and middle income homes and pensioners sitting in their rooms pretty cold because they were trying to do the right thing for the country by turning off the heating. So Pete did that in 2001 and 2003. We got about 9% savings in 2001. We got about 4% savings in 2003. It didn't quite get triggered in 2008 in that dry year. But you could sense the country's waning appetite to be asked every few years to go, for free, would you mind doing stuff? And it wasn't always for free. At Mercury, we developed a sort of a, we'll pay you some money back if you save compared to your last year's bill, but that was more the exception than the norm. But there are a lot of this was uncompensated. So that was another tool that we reached for. So demand side wasn't absent, it was ever present. But yeah, hot water, elegant, clever, conservation campaigns, not so much. Might skip over that, come back to that later. So where we've sort of ended up, just to summarise, is on our supply side, and by today I sort of mean the last 10 years, we've got a combination of geothermal, hydro, coal, gas, wind, some cogen in there, and around 3,000 to 4,000 megawatts out of that installed capacity of just shy of 10,000 megawatts. So about, let's call it 40% of our supply is flexible in that the sense you could send it a signal and tell it to turn up or turn down, and it can do that. Okay, so it's a reasonable chunk of the system. Over on the demand side, there's your 660 megawatts of instantaneous hot water demand response. Meridian recently signed a deal with the smelter that gave them 70 megawatts on a short-term basis and said, if I give you a signal, can you please turn down 70? But then there's a longer-term thing, which is around that longer-term response in a dry year. Fascinating this year that they can use the 185 megawatt response, I think 4 times in a 20-year contract. Within weeks of inking the deal, that was this year, they had already 1 strike down, 3 strikes to go. So that was good to see that tool in the market. And then just at the other end of the scale, which is this peak demand response, 10th of May, some of you may have been aware of the 10th of May thing where everything got very, very cold. There was a bunch of generation out and Transpower put out a call to say, I think we might have a problem tomorrow morning on May the 10th, and got about, again, voluntary response from households of about 200 megawatts. Again, uncompensated, right? So that's a bit untidy, but at least you can get a sense of how much sort of latent demand response is sitting there in the system. The bit looking forward is where this starts to really lay the groundwork for flexibility in my view. So the left-hand, the 3 bars here, left-hand bar is just that picture I showed you on the previous slide, just the makeup of our supply stack today. And by the way, this is under the Climate Change Commission's reference path, not their demonstration path. I'm just going for the conservative policy reference case, okay? So if we fast forward, pick a date, any date, I've picked 2040. If we go forward on the Climate Change Commission's projections of what's going to be built in terms of supply side resources, if you can see the colours there, first thing we're going to do is we're going to turn off some of the things that are currently providing that flexibility into the market, coal and gas. This is not an advertisement for coal and gas. I'm just observing we're going to turn off coal and gas. And the stuff we're going to build, not only to replace the coal and gas, but to meet the demand growth that's likely to come as a result of the decarbonisation by electrification, is going to be stuff that isn't that flexible. I can't tell the wind to blow a certain amount. I can't tell the sun to shine. Geothermal just runs in 5th gear the whole time. It's in overdrive because that's the way the steam cycle works. So I've got the majority of stuff I'm shoving in has its own mind to some extent about what it's going to operate at, and the stuff I'm taking out was the stuff I was using to respond to those flexibility events. So Market Development Advisory Group, if any of you come across that report, I was on the secretariat of that for the last 2.5 years. Large, very wordy, multi-page report weighing down the internet on the Electricity Authority's website. There's a whole lot of stuff which dives into what are the implications of this for volatility in the market and where could demand-side flexibility help. And there's some recommendations that went to the authority that are starting to say the market settings we have today are probably not fit for what's coming next, so we need to make some changes. So that sort of idea of we're taking out some flexible stuff, we're sticking in some inflexible stuff, we need to do something here, and this is where around the world everyone's looking at their own version of this graph and going, maybe getting the demand side back engaged would be a good way to do this. I might come back to the dollars. So just grinding fine, what can it actually do? So this is a graphic that Craig, who's the chief doer at FlexForum, and I concocted. And these slides, I assume, will be available for these guys after. Is that right? Yeah, cool. It's up on the FlexForum website. It's on our LinkedIn feed, where what we tried to do is we tried to say, what are all the pieces in the puzzle that flexibility can provide value for? And we're going to come back later to why the different colours, just to give it away, is to say, how easy is it for the human, the household, the business, the community today to get value from the system for providing that service? Can they even provide that service to the system? And if they are, can they get value for it? But you can see the kind of things there, distribution investment deferral. So if Dan up the top at PowerCo is thinking about when is a line going to need to be built, if I'm thinking peak demand's growing like this and I might have a $5 million investment I've got lined up to increase capacity to accommodate that, could I nudge that out by 1 year, 2 year, 3 year by using flexibility? That's what we mean by that. Same on the transmission front, there's a whole lot of wholesale stuff, just like charging a battery when prices are low and discharging it when prices are high, and a bunch of other stuff there. That theoretically, flexibility could provide these services, and we'll come back later as to the reality of that. Number of organisations, I think I walked in at the end of Marcos's presentation where he was talking about 6.7 billion or 5.9 billion or something like that. I'm not sure whether it's one of these reports on the screen, but ECA, bottom right, smart charging of electric vehicles, so timing the charging to not be at those peak times in the network, which would be the convenience approach. I drive in the driveway at 6 o'clock, I plug the car in and go, let's go. That's probably eventually going to fry the network. But doing it smart could save $4 billion in network costs, right? Over on the left, Boston Consulting Group did a very fancy, glossy, sexy report for the industry that said similar things. I think down there, they said that the cost of additional capacity construction that could be avoided could be 820 million in the 2020s and 8.7 billion in the 2040s. Sapere Research Group, my lot, a couple of colleagues of mine, Karina Commandant, Toby Stevenson, David Reeve, wrote a report, I think for the Authority, either the Authority or Transpower, that did, what's the economic surplus that New Zealand could realise if it did this distributed energy resources thing well, of which a subset of those things is flexibility. They said, look, $6.9 billion by 2050. These are not hundreds of thousands of dollars. These are billions we're talking about. So look, I'll get out of bed every day and run it a few $1 billion if I can kind of improve the chance that this happens. And that's what motivates me through the FlexForum. So big numbers, these are the kind of things that potentially we could be talking about flexibility. The question is, who captures that benefit? How does that money flow? Does it flow to the people that are providing the services? So primary flex devices, sure this is covering Marcos's ground, but really two broad categories of things. And you've already heard Phoebe primarily talk about this in her presentation. If you've got some kind of inbuilt storage, you've got an electric vehicle, which is just a large battery with 4 wheels attached, or space and water heating, there's the potential to turn it off before peak times, turn it back on after peak times, and you haven't really lost anything, right? As long as the water doesn't go cold in the hot water cylinder, I haven't had my service interrupted as long as it doesn't stay off so long it does go cold. Potentially the same with a car. We might come back to some of the gremlins. I think we've got a more tactile response with our ability to drive, that we may be less happy about someone starting to fiddle with my charging in my car. I may want the comfort blanket like they do in Norway at the moment. If you own an electric vehicle in Norway, you can go online and say, I need it at 80% battery by 7 a.m. because I take my kids to school. For the rest of the day, you can discharge it down to 50% within those two parameters, you know, fill your boots and have a play with it. So there's those things. And if those things, if you really want to say, look, I mean, I'd be like this, cold winter's night in Queenstown, it's -10, you are not touching my heat pump at 21 degrees. I'm staying warm. Well, that's not me, actually, it'd be my wife and kids. They're soft. But, you know, that's the framing for a lot of people. So if it doesn't, this is where chemical batteries, behind the meter batteries sitting in a home can do the same thing without even interfering with your enjoyment of electricity, right? So a battery could sit there and charge when things were off peak and discharge back into the system when things are on peak. So they're the two primary flex devices. This isn't just a household thing. I'm going to talk in a second, I might show it now. So we're also talking about large industrial applications, electrode boilers, industrial heat pumps for under 100-degree water. You've now got steam heat pumps coming into the market. These are big, hairy pieces of equipment. This is Open Country Dairy here, where I think Meridian, as the retailer, has the option to compensate Open Country Dairy to reduce their demand from an electrode boiler by 27 megawatts. Now it's a big chunk of capacity that can be used there to respond to market signals. And ECA's Regional Energy Accelerator, Transition Accelerator program has dug into, well, so far we're up to about 13 regions, I think, Marcos. We're nearly there last year coming, and going around the country and looking what these process heat opportunities are, biomass, electricity, and how could it provide flexibility in there as well. And there's a lot of good thinking going on there. But more broadly, the opportunity for electrification, again, at risk of repeating what you heard earlier, I've just used rewiring Aotearoa's chart. This is the piece of work they did with Paul Conway from the Treasury. The report's up on Rewiring's website that sort of suggested big benefits here to us as an economy, another 10.7 billion per year if everyone electrifies everything in their households. You can go online and grab that off their website. The point for flexibility is, number one, doing this is going to drive up demand. I think we've all kind of calmed down about that and just accepted it that that's going to be the case. But we are requiring customers to buy things that are significant energy users, right? So they're going to have a significant impact, but the significant opportunity, because the flip side of it is, when you're talking about heat pumps and electric vehicles, they're pretty sophisticated smart devices. It's not a laptop or a toaster we're talking about here. These things are packed with power electronics, which means I can talk to them, I can potentially automate things. We'll come to the consumer trust issues in a second. But in a way, the thing that's driving demand up is also creating this opportunity that as we do that, have we got the settings and market frameworks in place to be able to, it's the only time you're going to do that with the customer is at the point of transaction. Don't wait till they've owned the electric vehicle and got into their habits on charging for a year and then say, hey, I want you to change all your habits. That's a lot harder conversation to have than when you purchase the vehicle and say, look, here's a smart way to charge your vehicle. Here's some retailers that might offer you a cool tariff, something like that. So having the right interventions in place as we go up this curve is important. ECA's done some cracking work on optimizing EV charging. We wrote a paper for ECA on how do you turn that work into a work plan. What are the practical things we need to do to get there? That's available on FlexForum's website. And of course, distributed solar and batteries. Again, citing Rewiring's work, they've sort of established that if we get the finance right, because not all of us have $25,000 sitting around to go and throw on a solar panel and a battery, but if we get the financing right, not this kind of 5-year interest-free thing where I basically need to pay off a large loan over a very short period of time. If I can afford to pay off 30 grand over 5 years, I can probably afford to pay it up front, let's be frank. What we need are finance products that spread it over the life of the asset. We need 15-year, 20-year finance products, which means the low and middle income households can get in the game. Because if you finance rooftop solar over that period, it will be cheaper than what you are paying for grid-based electricity right now. It's just there's a small proportion of households that can afford the upfront cost, so we've got to get the finance right. Right, here's the fun bit. I'm just going to start by reflecting. There's a question, and Jen's asked a couple of people the question. You've asked questions about what's the market setting you would change, and I think there's a list, right? And MDAG's recommendations. I can't even remember. I think there were 32 recommendations that we put back to the authority for things that need to be changed in the market settings to enable us to do this next bit. But there is a view that it's markets themselves that are the problem here in terms of enabling some of that stuff. And I'm going to separate the idea of markets from the particular design we have in New Zealand. And just observe that this guy, Paul Josko, some of you may know, MIT professor, one of the global giants of electricity market design over the years, was around in the 90s when we were all trying to figure out how to make this all work. He made some observations here, and this is very sort of late 90s, 2000s type stuff, thinking about people reacting to variations in wholesale market prices. But if you just put the wholesale market prices dynamic thing aside, this is in his foundational prescription for electricity market design. So this wasn't a patronizing pat on the head for the demand side saying, I'll throw you some crumbs under the table as I think about my market design. He was saying this is an utterly essential part of making markets work. Because if you don't have the demand side involved, you're essentially ascribing all the power to the supply side to do that work for you. So you really need this stuff. And I could have grabbed any of the 10 great authors, Severin Borenstein, Jim Bushnell, Bill Hogan, Dieter Helm, the list goes on, who all at the time were saying things like this. Don't forget that you've got to facilitate the demand side getting involved in your market process if this is going to have a chance of working. And look, we could go to town on that slide and talk about the reality of it. And Paul has adjusted his view in his, I think, 2019, 2020 paper. He accepted, as I think most of us had, that the idea of having consumers sort of on tap to a half-hourly varying spot price, probably, yeah, let's just walk back from that a little bit. But he did say, well, if someone could be doing that on the consumer's behalf and the consumer gets the benefit, that's more the arrangement we should be thinking about. And again, hot water control, incredibly elegant, okay? Someone controls it, it's a power board, it's an EDB, got the control, doing things in my hot water. I don't notice the water going cold, but I get $50 off my bill. Perfect consumer product, right? Not perfect, maybe a bit strong. Anyway, the other bit of background just before we get into the challenges, and actually this is one of the challenges, is for all the excitement about demand-side management and demand-side flexibility as we came into the 21st century, there were just some technological and market realities that meant, at least in New Zealand, that the value case wasn't quite there. Firstly, and I know Janet, who's gone, is going to do a talk about the rollout of smart meters. We couldn't even measure for households. I think commercial and industrial, we had revenue grade metering in there, but at least for households, we had the old spinny meters that would only tell me what you had consumed when we sent the meter person around to do the meter reading, right? So even if you had decided to do something smart, like turn something off at peak times and then turn it on later that evening, I wouldn't have been able to tell as your retailer. So there was no way for me to reward you for that because I didn't know it had happened. That was the case until, and New Zealand was the first country in the world to voluntarily roll out smart metering. It wasn't a spectacular success, but at least we got on the bus really quickly, and I'm sure Janet's going to talk to you about that stuff this afternoon. Back at that time, really, we had heat pumps kind of growing in this 2000 to 2015 period, which I'm talking about here. Hot water control was there. The automation was pretty low. I remember being at University of Canterbury in the late 90s, and our signal to conserve power was a bright orange flashing light as you stepped out of the lifts in the James Height Tower, and it would be flashing and we'd run around and turn off the printers at the wall and try and flick the lights off in the offices that weren't getting used. I mean, that's a really high engagement reliance you've got there with the consumer to be running around and doing stuff. Okay, so the lack of automation, unless you'd spent $50,000, you know, Bill Gates style on a Honeywell or Schneider Electric automation system, which tended to be used by rich people just to turn their pool lights on at the right time, wasn't really doing much for the electricity market. The wholesale volatility itself, the half-hour to half-hour variation in prices, was actually pretty low because at that stage, our hydro capacity is amazing, like it's incredibly flexible things. It's still some of the power stations in New Zealand, in both Mercury on the Topol scheme and Meridian on the Waitaki, they can still respond faster to variations in demand than an advanced open cycle gas turbine. So these are phenomenal machines that we built in the last century, but they do most of the heavy lifting of sort of shifting stuff from peak to off peak. That's not going to be the case as we start building more wind and solar. And from a network perspective, Dan might disagree, but I think in the 2015, demand growth was relatively predictable, and the rate at which you augmented your network and built stuff was pretty doable from a networks perspective. Now, today's different. Firstly, we've got our advanced meters widespread. Secondly, 75, well, probably more now, that number must be out of date, 75,000 electric vehicles on the road, more than 10,000 behind the meter batteries in households. I wish the Electricity Authority would get that data set sorted out because I'm pretty convinced on ME it's not right. And we've got now more advanced hot water control systems coming in than HIP hot water control. So the actual things we've got to lay our hands on are much more distributed and available. Customer engagement, you know, it's all about comms and automation now. Again, we've got to deal with the consumer trust thing. So we're reducing the need for customers to be sitting there in the morning going shivers, how am I going to schedule my stuff to optimize around this? We just want them to not have to worry about that because I've got other things to do. Wholesale volatility, holy smoke, the last 5 years, I mean, it's just the whole gas situation in New Zealand has led to, and you throw a couple of dry years in, you know, those 1 in 100 dry years that happen every 3 years. That's how the maths works, isn't it, Jen? Yeah, so you throw those together and you've just had this unprecedented level of wholesale volatility, which may be a bit of a hint of what's to come as you start removing coal and gas from the system and adding in wind and solar, and network build. Wow, all of a sudden, the network companies are saying, well, shivers, if all this electrification is going to come, demand on my network's going to do like that. Some of them, it's quite a patchwork across the 29 as to who's experiencing what, but some of them are sitting there saying, I'm not even sure this stuff is fundable, the rate at which I need to expand the networks. The regulators sort of having a look at it and going, I'm not sure I trust you guys, I might knock you back on some of the investments. Some of the EDBs are going, can I even fund this? Can I even get the contractors out there to dig up the streets and do some of the stuff? So there's a really interesting space in the networks at the moment going, how's this going to roll from here? So this is, I mean, other than the challenges that EDBs and others face, this is sort of saying there's opportunity here, right? Because now all of a sudden I can start to seriously tap into some of those value streams that we had in that picture before. And I'm going to go back to the colours on this that Craig and I put in there, which is if it's dark blue, so backup power and increased utilisation of self-generation, if you have that kit, they are the only things that we could stick hand on heart and say the consumer can routinely and easily access that stuff if they've got that kit. The other stuff, the stuff that's almost white, black start, frequency keeping, voltage support, sort of geeky ancillary services stuff, look, most consumers can't even access those markets. And there's an aspect of that where you kind of go black start, which is relivening the grid from dead. Not sure that's a time we might be using our batteries and our electric vehicles to do that. So maybe it's an okay thing that I can't access those value streams. It's the ones shaded in that sort of weird aqua color in the middle there where we're focusing most of our effort at the moment. Because what that color means is that there have been in some times and places transactions done to reward some people for these services: wholesale response, transmission investment deferral, distribution investment deferral, congestion relief, and fast and sustained reserve. But it's neither easy nor routine, or the benefit isn't getting shared, or the benefit's getting highly averaged, something like that. This is where we feel like the work needs to be done at the moment. So as a result, the value stack, if you like, which is what we call this diagram, it's not full. So if you're thinking about how you get the maximum deployment of flexibility, you've got to think about, well, am I rewarding people with the value that they would be creating there? That's sort of test number one in my mind. I'm going to finish up with a few slides on this here, and this might be some stimulation for some questions. One of the joys of being on FlexForum and having that spectrum of people is you kind of get to eavesdrop in a public way, eavesdrop on the conversations that happen across the industry. And we had a meeting earlier this week where we were talking about that jigsaw puzzle previously and really getting to the nitty-gritty from the various parts of the supply chain about, have we got this right? Do you think we've been unfair? Do you think we've been too fair? And fascinating conversations, and all that stuff will be recorded and up on the FlexForum website. But here's just a sample of things that I think this is where we need your help if you're researchers in the room from Otago, that this is interesting stuff, right? So coordination, first kind of challenge is there's more than one market player in the flexibility space. And I've mentioned both of them, a retailer and a distributor at least. So a distributor's looking at it going, can I optimize the rate at which I build assets out to the future? Can flexibility help me with that? A retailer's looking at how much it costs to buy your power from the wholesale market. And that's a half-hourly varying thing. Two separate entities separated in the Bradford reforms, but we kind of need to figure out how those two entities work together somehow in terms of optimizing the use of flexibility. Herding is a big thing for electric vehicle charging particularly. So retailers who go out there and say, free power between X and Y time. And what did I do with my Nissan Leaf? I just go and punch in the numbers on the thing, say, just make sure you don't charge until 11 p.m. happens. And what happens? Everyone does the same thing. And all we've done is taken a whole lot of electricity out of the traditional peak, 5 to 9 p.m., and we've shifted it into 9 to 12 p.m. And we're at risk of creating a new peak there. Now, I mean, with only 75,000 electric vehicles on the road, that's not a national problem or probably even a regional problem yet, but in some particular parts and suburbs of the country, you do have EDB starting to notice that you've got this, everyone's trying to do the same thing because they've got the same signal saying free charging now as everyone goes. So that's something we've got to work on. Confidence and trust. Again, I'm going to pick on not pick on, but cite the networks here. But if you think about a distribution network planner sitting there looking at 10-year asset management plan going, I'm looking at, just as I said before, looking at peak demand, my winter evening peak is increasing through time because people are sticking in heat pumps, I reckon I need an investment to stop the lights going out by date, let's say 2031. Batstone comes along and says, I reckon I can provide you with some flexibility that can kick that out. How much do you need? I need 3 megawatts. $5 million investment or something. I need 3 megawatts. Have I got 3 megawatts? Yeah, probably not. So the challenge for the network planner is when I'm making a decision on that investment, can I trust that stuff's going to turn up? If you're saying by 2031, you're going to have a bunch of people that are willing to turn off a bunch of things at the right time, does that give me the confidence to defer it? Because if they don't turn up, I might have a bit of a problem, and then I'm on the front page of the local rag saying X, Y, Z happened. Now I'm sort of paraphrasing the discussion here, but that is actually quite an important conversation. So that building confidence, chicken and egg. Again, going back to in this industry, scale matters. So, a particular market participant might say, it only matters if you can give me 5 megawatts of response across your households. I go, well, I can't give you 5 because I need to play with 300 kilowatts of this stuff to make sure everything's working. The problem is 300 kilowatts is not of much interest to someone who wants 5 megawatts of the stuff. So I can't give you 5 megawatts until I've figured out with the 300 kilowatts how it's going to work, but then that's of no interest to you, so you may not be interested in that. So how these organisations form the business case around starting to deploy this stuff has that kind of chicken and egg thing. Accessing value, we've talked about the jigsaw diagram, and there's still a question there about it. Are we, and I include myself in this, when we tackle these problems, are we still coming at it from too much of a supply side framing for this rather than coming at it from a more balanced supply and demand side? I guess one of my points, just about in closing, I'm going to talk you through one more thing. These are human behaviour issues. There is some tech that needs to be developed and tested and deployed and checked as part of this, but a lot of these things are actually confidence and trust, coordination. A lot of it's about people getting around the table and giving each other assurance that this stuff can work and essentially working together. In terms of our work, won't dwell on this too much. I'm going to talk mostly, but there's insights paper on the FlexForum's website. I'm just going to talk you through one thing that was pretty interesting to me that we did this year, which is around the flexibility plan, but we do insights papers, advice to regulators. It's all available on the website, and I'm going to come back to Flex Day in a second. The flexibility plan was written by the sort of founders of the FlexForum idea in August 2022. What the flexibility plan was 39 actions that were described as practical, scalable, and low regrets. And they're quite defined things you would do to enable this great world of flexibility being available easily and routinely to households, businesses, and communities. A lot of people find reading that document a little bit like jamming knitting needles in your eyes, and I don't. It's very, very detailed, but it was deliberately detailed to say, let's get super practical and specific about what needs to happen. So if you want to have a read of the flexibility plan, please go and do it. The thing I want to tell you about is we did an assessment 3 months ago. Craig and I did an assessment of progress against that plan. So it came out in August 2022. So we're 2 years down the track, and we asked, how are we going across the 39 actions as an industry? And we got about I think it was 13 experts engaged to be quite independently honest about how well a progress we were making. You can see a lot of them were started, some midway. One was done, which was set up the FlexForum. So that was kind of self-fulfilling. And there were a bunch that weren't yet started. And the not yet started isn't necessarily a bad thing, because sometimes they need to wait for something else to happen. There's a sequencing thing here. But the started ones, yeah, that's where most of it was. Then we did this cut. I just want you to focus on the top box just for 30 seconds. We had a crack at a really bodged together customer journey. So if you think about a household or a business looking at flexibility, What are the phases they go through? So there are customer journey people in the room who will be much better at this than me. But we said there's a discover phase, you figure out what your options are. Am I even aware of what I can do? Is my retailer going to reward me for doing stuff? How does that work? There's an assess phase, which is where I go, out of all the ways I could do this, which is the one I'm going to go with. There's an enable. I put the smart electric vehicle charger on the wall, or I put in the smart hot water heat pump, or whatever it is. I enable it, and then I operate it, actually make the thing work. What we observed was that most of the industry effort was at the operate end. That's what the bars mean, and that's a relative score out of 1 to 5. You could see the progress was most at the operate/enable. And that's kind of understandable because the industry is fascinated by the how do I make this stuff work, right? If I got my hands on a whole lot of electric vehicle chargers, if I got my hands on a whole lot of hot water heat pumps, what would I do with it? But the problem is there was far less on the first couple of steps for the human. And I experienced this personally when just before leaving my family and getting on a plane and going to Canada, our hot water cylinder crapped itself, water coming out. And I'm standing there with the plumber, my wife, looking at me going, do something. Plumber's standing there going, you need to replace your hot water cylinder. And I'm on my phone going, well, hang on, this is a moment where I could get some fancy tech in it, or I could go for a heat pump version of it. And it was a nightmare trying to discover what my options were, let alone trying to figure out if my retailer would give me any kind of rewards for giving them the control. And I was sitting here in the middle of doing this work going, this is hard, right? Now, for us geeks, we kind of bash our way through that. I couldn't with that one. I just had to say, stick the same thing in again because we've got no hot water. I'm about to get on a plane. We need hot water. So it was a missed opportunity, but it was bamboozlingly complex from a customer's perspective. So that became very palpable for me as we were doing this kind of thing. So this insight that we need to lift our game and how are we thinking about the human that makes the decision? How are we getting their attention? How are we making sure they know what options they have, that they've got all the information they need to evaluate it? And maybe that's an automated thing. And if there's one rule change I'd want the authority to make, it's to make consumer data instantly available at the click of a button to every single person, not this 1 day, 2 day, previously 5 day bollocks. You've got to make it instantly available so that this is all automatable. I'll get off that hobby horse. So this drove us to Flex Day, which happened in Christchurch, and I think Michael was there. I don't know whether there was anyone else there from University of Otago. It was a cracking day. We got 55 people from around the membership together, and the focus was how are we going to make this easier for the human, for the household, the business, the community? What are the things we need to put in place? Focus on learning by doing. We were very clear with everyone on that day. We're coming out of today with a plan to do something, not write another paper or have another conversation. We're coming out, and we ended up with 7 proposals of things that we do. We're just working through with the various teams that developed those proposals on the day. But it was a fantastic day. We had Andrew Fraser from Elemental in Australia, came across to share his wisdom, having done this numerous times in Aussie. Cracking day. So I'm going to wind it up there, other than saying, the researchers in the room, we need you. You're a member, if you're Otago, you're a member of FlexForum. If you have a look at the influence that ANU's had on the Australian development of Flex, it's been phenomenal. Let's have a chat about what we can do, because there's a wicked opportunity and you guys have the skills. I know you have the skills because I still do keep touch with Michael and Janet. Let's do some cool stuff.
Thanks, Stephen. Amazing talk, as always. Do we have any questions in the room, first of all? I think you've covered everything. Any questions online, Michael?
Michael said,
no. Go on then.
I didn't ask you a question, Marcos.
No, it's a good question. I just need, you've got a lot of expertise and you're at the forefront of it. We talked about retailers and distribution companies and generators, and you've got membership. Who would you like to see lean more into the FlexForum or into flexibility? is the question. And I just wanted to say, I really strongly agree with this trusted messenger and moments of time. So we've engaged with master plumbers and master electricians to try and upskill the workforce, so that when they are having conversations with customers, it is breaks that path dependency. But
yeah, well, great question, and you've given half of my answer, which, you know, it's kind of like your doctor and your physio and your nurse, the people that you just put trust in that they know what they're doing. And when the plumber was sitting, and the conversation I had with the plumber too, and I'm so stoked to hear that you guys are leaning into that one, was hot water heat pumps. He's kind of going, oh, I don't know whether you need to stick them on the outside of the building. They're a bit noisy, and your neighbours might, you know. So there's that conversation. Saul Griffith from Rewiring Australia in America talks about the number of times the conversations they had with households about getting rid of gas were unwound when the plumber turned up and said, oh no, you don't want to get rid of gas, mate. You know, you want to keep it there just in case the lights go out. And all that work was undone. So that aspect of it was critical. For me personally, no longer chair, but getting an actual consumer voice in there, I hate the word consumer, but a people voice, because we only have smatterings of that in there, most of them are inside organisations, and the disestablishment of the Consumer Advocacy Council was a real disappointment, because having them, we did have some great conversations with Deb Hart and co leading up to this, but again, we say we're doing this for the household, business and the community, but the rubber only hits the road when you ask the household, the business and the community that we've actually made it easy for them. So that would be the other bit for me. But yeah, good question. Yep. Don't know who's doing the choosing.
My question is, you started off by saying a lot of countries have got this challenge, increasing the size of the grid, increasing generation. And there's some experiences in the UK with Octopus and Flex and National Grid. And that was tried as a pilot, and now it's part of their kind of toolkit. So the question is, how much can we learn from other countries and adopt? And in terms of rewiring Aotearoa, they've got electrified towns springing up around the country like wildfire. And one of those groups has printed and is supplying the community with labels that go on your hot water cylinder. So when it breaks, it says, ring this number for your heat pump.
Brilliant. That's awesome.
So just to go back to the question, what can we learn from overseas jurisdictions that have similar challenges?
What can we learn? I mean, there's a lot packed into an answer to that. But I think Australia is probably a couple of years ahead of it. But you mentioned the UK. You know, they started their flexibility journey probably realistically 2012. I think they did their roadmap 2015. UK Power Networks released its paper, and it's a demonstration of how long the gestation period is in this stuff, and that's my growing sense of urgency, is we needed to start this 3 years ago to be on that bus, but we can learn a lot from the UK. Some of the European member states, we got to hang out quite a bit with the Association of the energy regulators across all the member states of the EU. Some of those countries are doing some pretty innovative things. They're releasing standards and guides so everyone can agree on a standard contract specification, flexibility, things like that. We don't need to reinvent that stuff. We might need to tweak it, but we don't need to go through the 2 years of consultation and blah, 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 blah to do it.
That says 5.3 will display the car battery.
Yeah.
When they're just withdrawing from New Zealand.
Yep.
So like,
Time is of the essence. And you know, the voltage change that MB's consulting on at the moment, which will, I think we were talking about before, potentially unlock a lot more export from rooftop solar. We're one of the last countries in the OECD to go from sort of plus or minus 6% on voltage to the now global standard of plus or minus 10%. That will make a massive difference. So that consultation's happening now, but again, needed to happen 4 years ago. But I'm impatient. You might have got that sense from me. But yeah, I think there is a lot we can pick up from overseas. And I'll just reinforce even just having Andrew Fraser from Australia there to give that guide about when you're going through this process with humans and households and businesses, here's some things to remember. And he's got some great little gems that are up on our website from that. Yep.
Can I just ask, so I was at Downstream earlier this year, and there was talk of a distributed system operator, and there's talk of, there was a whole lot of entrepreneurs brought along by ECA talking about we've set up a little company, we've got a VPP, we gather up distributed energy and we offer it into the market. So another idea is a demand response market. Is this going to grow organically with lots of nudging from government agencies, or do we need something big like a distributed system operator or a demand response market?
Yeah, that's an awesome question, and one that was very live in the conversation earlier this week. And it was interesting to hear, the people who are thinking about a demand response platform and developing that and what it would mean, and the people who might be the buyers. And they were sort of just tiptoeing towards each other on this conversation. But one of the comments that really struck me was, it's almost like for the buyers, gentailers, distribution companies, to move, there needs to be almost a standing offer that's there. We'll pay $50 for flexibility that will allow the entrepreneurs to say, I can see in 3 years' time someone's going to pay me $50. At the moment, we don't have that confidence. And, government underwrites have been used for a whole bunch of stuff on the supply side. I would love to see some kind of, let's just de-risk the development of flex so that the small players can quickly develop into the megawatt scale. But at the moment, it's like, I could spend all this money developing a piece of kit, but I'm not quite sure. I'm not talking about subsidies here. I'm just talking about a standing price that is in the market that would need to be recovered somehow. But you kind of need that confidence when you're at that valley of death as an entrepreneur.
Yeah, I mean, I was trading on the ASX when we had to do market making because they force the big players to trade to make our market. So,
That's right.
It's a similar sort of thing.
Yeah, it's a market making thing. That's a
Yeah,
great
yeah,
way to think about it, actually. I might steal that. Thank you.
What do you think?
An idea I had. So I think there's flexibility more generally, and then there's flexibility in response to these, real emergency situations. An idea I thought of in relation to those kind of emergency situations, I was talking about how there's a lot of difficulty getting for householders to get access to these wholesale spot price markets, but that would be the most incredible incentive, right? What about the idea that the government would have some kind of emergency situation that they could flick a switch and say, we're now in this situation? And would it be possible from the retailers and distribution companies' point of view to sort of unlock wholesale prices that would get fed back to the customer just in those specific periods? Could that work?
Totally, and there's almost a precedent. It's not quite I think it's an approximation what you're talking about in our code today, because if under the code the lakes do go very dry, we got quite close to this in August this year, where under the code the system operator has to call an emergency hydro situation. Instantly at that point, every single retailer has to pay every domestic customer, I think it's been inflation adjusted to $11.89 a week for the duration of that campaign. Now it's a bit of a kludged, blunt instrument, but there is no equivalent in the code for that for the May the 10th type situations where someone hits the big red button and say, we've got a problem tomorrow night. As soon as I call that, some mechanism is kicked in to say, we can't keep doing the situation where we're asking for voluntary savings uncompensated. We need to figure out a mechanism by which people would be rewarded. So the only reason I go to that one is because there is a cut, copy and paste version of that in our code for hydro. And I think you're sort of hinting towards one that's a bit more of a short term, which I totally agree. We've got to address that problem. Yep.
We'll just have one quick question and then we'll have to wrap it up.
Dr Stephen, thank you. Awesome. And I can say Control Focus here in Dunedin. They've got some good skills with, not only putting in hot water heat pumps, but also if you've already got a 400 litre cylinder in your house and you need to put in a hot water heat pump connection into that, he's got the
retrofit one. Yeah, that's cool.
So magic. But the question, you touched on the discovery and assessment as parts that we're under investing in. Can you go into a bit of detail of what you found so far as to solutions or initiatives?
Yeah, look, there were 2 projects that came out of Flex Day of people saying, we've even got to start almost with the customer journey again, figure out what's the process people are going through, because we don't want to be so arrogant to say those of us that have been in the industry for 25 years know what the process should be for a customer. So we're sort of walking backwards from that and going, let's actually talk to customers about what that process looks like. What are the kind of times where you would make a decision? What kind of information do you need? Versus, I would rather just hand it over to a question mark and have them take care of it. And that could be a tradie. It could be the appliance retailer. It could be Mitre 10. But I think that's an interesting thing to go, let's not just assume that the customer is going to want to sit there. And even if we make the Google, we make power switch for flexibility type thing, may not necessarily be the answer. It may be that a lot of people are saying, I'm just way too busy in my life, taking the kids to school and doing the shopping and yada, yada, yada. How do we make that more automatic? So yeah, that's the first branch in the tree I'd be looking at. And those projects that, those couple of projects that came out of Flex Day, that's what they're hinting at. Yeah.
Okay, we better wrap it up there, but join me in thanking Stephen for a great talk.